for joining us today. I'd like to welcome Abigail Brooks. Thank you so much for joining us.
So nice to be here.
It's great to have you once again. So Abigail is the Director of Women's Studies at Providence College, and she's an assistant professor. Some of her areas of expertise include sociology of gender, feminist theory, media studies, and sociology of the body. She also is an author and has her PhD in sociology with a focus on women's issues. We want to make sure to give you all your accolades in there.
You're so nice.
Give credit where it's due. So we wanted
to
have you in here today and have a worthwhile discussion, which we started back there. The headlines recently have been dominated with both locally and nationally, with women making allegations against men, sexual harassment and sexual abuse. So let's start with locally. There have been women in the State House making allegations of sexual harassment, saying that their bills would go farther if traded for sexual favors. Pretty alarming.
Yes, absolutely.
And women haven't named names. There have been instances, I mean, it's been overwhelming, these headlines that have been made both locally and nationally. Give me your thoughts on this as we move forward.
Yeah, well, the not naming names issue locally, I mean, in the Rhode Island State House case studies, I think, just speaks to the ongoing culture of fear, I think, that women are experiencing in terms of what might happen if they named names, what might happen if they labeled what was happening to them as unjust or began to speak out or fight back. Certainly we know we have data that demonstrates that when women do speak out against sexual harassment, sexual abuse, there's so many negative repercussions that they can experience. If you're thinking about sexual harassment in the workforce, for example, we know that around 75% of women who do report harassment in the workforce experience a whole host of negative repercussions, whether it's the harassment increases, whether it's they lose out on their positions, they lose out on promotions. So there's a lot to lose, I think, for women in terms of coming forward and naming names, which I think just bespeaks the larger culture of ongoing gender inequality. Certainly in many realms of professional life, and politics are not immune to those gender inequalities. So I think I'm very sympathetic and feel a lot of empathy to the women who recently have come forward with their stories. I know Tansy came forward on Monday, I believe. Her story broke, and I believe that she noted that she had experienced harassment and or abuse as recently as June of 2017. So I'm very empathetic and sympathetic. I think a lot of what's been said by other female women currently serving in the Rhode Island State House is really interesting, along the lines of, does it really matter who it is in terms of that individual male? Yes, it does, because they should be held accountable, and we certainly should take legal action potentially, but it's a cultural issue. Which I'm really happy to hear a lot of, these state representatives, these female state representatives articulating, like, it's not just about this one individual male and naming his name. We really need to look at the broader culture and just how prevalent harassment is for so many of us.
I find that pretty alarming. A couple points that you made there, that it's a culture issue, and that needs to change. So we'll get to that. But very alarming that you mentioned a statistic: 75% of women, a study that you mentioned, 75% of women who move forward with allegations see negative repercussions. So how does that translate for anyone who's spoken up, and whether they name names, they face who has ever targeted them? What does that say for people who want something to be done about this? I mean, what does that say for women who want to be empowered?
I know, it's so hard not to feel discouraged. I mean, and we know, that sexual harassment, if we just look at the workforce, again, for women who are experiencing it, it's such a prevalent phenomenon. I mean, we don't have enough empirical study of it, but what we do know is that anywhere from 35% to 85% of women experience sexual harassment in the workforce today. Those are our most current stats in the United States. But absolutely, it's incredibly disheartening to know that if a woman does come forward with her story, if she does attempt to begin to hold that man or those men accountable, there are, these very real risks of negative repercussions. But what I would say is that it's so important to think about power in numbers. I mean, I think you know, this whole thing, this whole Me Too campaign, that we have this idea that it's not just an individual, you know, private trouble that one woman should feel shame or stigma about, or somehow she brought it on, but the more women can understand that no, it's not just an individual experience of injustice or suffering, but it's a shared experience. It's a cultural phenomena, power in numbers. I mean, that's you know, what we talk about in women's studies in terms of consciousness raising, right? This idea that, you know, it's not just what this one woman experienced or that woman over there experienced, but it's a shared phenomenon. And if we can have more women feeling confidence in numbers, I think that will enable more women to come forward, to share their stories. And it's just interesting too, this idea, actually the Me Too campaign was started in 2007. Much earlier, Alyssa Milano is now taking on the same language, but this idea of empowering women through empathy, right? You know, I too have had this experience. I'm going to now share my story, and really having that, it's like a transformation from a private trouble into a public issue. And we need to do that. I think this is a moment wherein that's happening. I mean, you know, the dozens upon dozens of women who are coming forward sharing their stories of abuse at the hands of Harvey Weinstein, for instance, and, you know, the more women that come forward, I think the more empowered more additional women feel to come forward. So I'm hopeful from the perspective of this idea of women feeling more comfortable in numbers. But I could go back in history and also say how, you know, we haven't made much progress since sexual harassment was first named, if you're interested in hearing a bit of sort of the backstory.
Oh, definitely.
In the U.S. as well.
I think so. I think we'll get to that in a moment. I do want to stick, just before we get to that, I want to talk, continue to talk a little bit more about this issue. Because I feel like it seems, as we look at history and then continue to try to make progress, looking at examples locally, if women who are in political power, who are political representatives, you know, we have elected these representatives.
Absolutely.
Is it up to them to name names? Is it up? Is it public? Should it be public knowledge? Because the women, the people that they alleged abused them, they've been elected as well. I mean, is it almost up to them? And if they can't name names, what does that say to women who are being victims in businesses and schools? I mean, is it almost like they shouldn't feel empowered? You know, I mean, it's a really tough situation.
It is. And again, I think, you know, I think there's a lot to unpack there.
Is it different in politics? You know, is it a different level?
No, absolutely. And I think, I mean, I should look at the statistics in the Rhode Island State House, you know, more specifically around what the representation of women is, the gender breakdown. But I mean, you know, nationally we have just under 20% representation, for example, in the United States and our Congress of women. So it's, you know, we're hovering just under 20%, and we compare and contrast quite negatively when you look at other industrialized nation states and many, quote, non-industrialized nation states in terms of our gender parity in politics. So, I mean, I think, you know, part of it, again, power in numbers. You know, if we had more women in general in politics, I think there would be an empowerment narrative there. It would be, there would just be less of this happening in terms of power in numbers, and in terms of just having more women able to articulate their voices, etc. But it's a really important point that you raise, because I do feel like that's a tension. You know, you don't want to have an expectation that any one individual woman is going to come forward and name the name of her abuser. You don't want to put that weight on her, and you want to understand.
After they've already allegedly gone through something traumatizing.
Exactly, and you want everybody to understand that maybe we should switch the narrative a bit and think about, okay, how can we all work together to make it's so that kind of harassment or abuse can no longer happen. How can we work together to create a culture that, and a sort of a structural, more legally protective system that prevents the harassment in the first place? And could that be the conversation? But I hear you. I mean, I think it could be a both and. Like, I think, I think it would be really, exciting, and maybe really push us forward more quickly if there was more of a naming of names, even among female politicians.
Which I think is so interesting too, because it's not just happening in our state house. In California, for example, I just read this article in the LA Times that 150 women in the California State House signed an open letter saying that sexual harassment is rampant in California. And in fact, a legislator there said they are trying to pass legislation, or they're going to work to introduce a bill next year to ban confidentiality provisions in monetary settlements stemming from sexual harassment, assault, and discrimination cases. So in that case, it wouldn't be private. Which is really interesting. You couldn't just sweep things under the rug.
No, that is interesting. And I think just to kind of think about, you know, women in politics a little bit more generally, and, you know, we certainly have underrepresentation, generally speaking, in the United States when it comes to women's participation in politics, and we're hoping that will continue to change, and our representation of women, absolutely, will continue to become closer to 50-50. Certainly we haven't yet elected a female president, all of that, we could go there. But I would just say that politics are no different than any other field, you know, despairingly, but that is the case. And it's not, you know, there's overt abuse, harassment, etc. But you can also just look at all the different ways in which female politicians experience gender bias, gender stereotyping, right? The ways in which a lot of the news media can present, you know, female politicians in ways wherein I would trouble over, i.e. talking about what they're wearing, what they look like, you know, whether they look too old, whether they haven't had plastic surgery, whether they haven't had plastic surgery, whether they're being good moms, you know, who's taking care of their children, if they're out on the campaign trail, right? So there is so much kind of gender bias and stereotyping that female politicians face, and I think that's part of this this larger reality that bespeaks ongoing gender, you know, inequality, and certainly, sadly, sexual harassment and abuse is part of that. But it is particularly despairing, I hear you, to know that even women lawmakers who've made it that far, right, and who should be and are shaping, right, our society in ways that, you know, that are largely benefiting many women, are also, right, bumping up against these gendered injustices.
So as we move forward, like you said so many times, and do you think we're on, because there's so many, we've seen it time and time again, you know, with Harvey Weinstein, we've seen it locally, we've seen it in other states, politics, allegations against Bill Clinton, Bill Cosby, Donald Trump, and it
Bill
felt
O'Reilly,
Bill O'Reilly,
at Fox,
I mean, over and over and over and over again. A lot of bills.
Totally.
It felt like we were on the brink of something. Will it change? I mean, and it's not. It felt like it with Anita Hill.
I know.
It felt like things would change. The world stopped.
I know.
And then, do you think there will be something? Is this time that'll move? But let's talk about that history and moving forward.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think. You know,
Can there be a cultural change?
I know. I mean, I think, you know, like I said a little bit earlier, you know, sexual harassment was first named in the mid-1970s in the context of second wave feminism, and particularly the radical feminist movements. And there was a group of women at Cornell University, you know, who articulated sexual harassment, who named it, who began to file suit around it. One woman in particular who left her job because of overt harassment from her boss, and then there was a movement that galvanized therein from this group of women in the mid-1970s at Cornell. And then in 1986 we had the Supreme Court ruling that enabled women to have legal recourse, right, to take up the matter of sexual harassment and hold employers accountable. And then we had 1991 with Anita Hill and the Anita Hill hearings, and yet, of course, Clarence Thomas was nominated and is now serving on the Supreme Court. So, and just to point out there, Anita Hill experienced so much backlash, so many negative repercussions. She had to leave her job, her home state, lots of harassments, you know, from, you know, sexualized, racialized, you know, lots of, you know, things related to, you know, overt death threats, etc. Now we know that she's moved to New England and she's a professor at Brandeis, but she had to change up her whole life after that, right? And she experienced so many negative repercussions. But we did hope in each of these instances that would be that watershed moment, right? All of a sudden, you know, it shifts from, oh, you know, something that a woman has to deal with privately, to no, like, this is a matter of public concern. We've named it. We can, you know, we can legislate around it. We can file suit against it. But I have to say that, you know, sadly, the statistics haven't really improved over these many years, and here we are again at another watershed moment where, Harvey Weinstein, one of the most powerful men in Hollywood, has all of these women coming forward with allegations. And so maybe it is a turning point. I mean, I think when you listen to feminists or, women who have been working on women's rights in the legal realm, or particularly specifically in sexual harassment, what I've been reading in a lot of cases is that, when are things really going to change? Like you said, we thought they would change in 1991 or 1986 or 1975. But I do think that this is a hopeful and exciting moment. And just so many people are coming forward, and of course we have the social media platform, right?
Yeah.
Which in some ways is exciting because it's democratizing. Almost every woman can access that, right? And share her story and speak out vis-a-vis social media. So I am hopeful. But I would just say, too, to throw out there, not to be gloom and doomy, but I think we really also need to examine sort of our culture at large and the ways in which young men and young women are being socialized into, gender roles, gender stereotypes, understanding women's value and men's value. For example, I don't know if you're familiar with Peggy Ornstein's work, but she wrote an op-ed in the spring of 2016, actually, in the New York Times, and now has a book out, Girls and Sex, but her work is all about the ways in which young men and young women are being socialized into understanding their roles, particularly in terms of sexual relations, vis-a-vis pornography, right? So this idea, we're living in a hyper-sexualized culture, right? And a culture wherein, yes, pornography is becoming increasingly normalized. So I think young women and men are really being socialized in ways that we have to trouble over as well, wherein women are being reduced to the object, right? Or to purely the body. And we see women and men, learning these kinds of messages in the context of our mediascape, in the context of our entertainment industry. And then I think that this is informing action and behavior. So, again, I'm not surprised that we're not any better off now than we were in 1991 because of sort of where our culture has been moving in some respects since then. And I think we have a lot of work to do in terms of, teaching and training, I would say men first, but also women, right, around our value, our identity, and the focus, again, on our mind, on our mental skill sets, right, versus our bodies. But I would just say so much of it has to do with the culture, and I hope we trouble over the culture as well, and not just the individual bad seeds, like Harvey Weinstein, he's such a terrible person, all of that. Of course, we have to hold them accountable as an individual, but again, I just keep coming back to, let's look at the cultural prevalence and how we can begin to work on prevention more broadly, not just through holding Weinstein accountable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And just before you go, because we do need to wrap up here, but you mentioned just kind of as a cultural and looking at things and teaching our children. But before you go, I just kind of wanted to get your intake on this. The language we use in talking about sexual harassment and sexual abuse. There's a quote that Jackson Katz, I think that's how you say his name, gave in a TED Talk, and he's a terrific speaker, but this quote has been widespread in articles and social media and stuff, and it is, quote, "We talk about how many women were raped last year, not about how many men raped women." So just the way that our culture speaks about sexual harassment or sexual abuse, it's passive. So this action was done to a woman. Do you think that changing the way that we speak about abuse can in turn change things?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love Jackson Katz's work. I use it in my my courses, my gender study courses at Providence College. And I think a huge contribution that he makes too is that when we talk about sexual violence against women, as you're saying, it's so often framed as a woman's issue. Let's teach women to resist. Let's teach women to prevent sexual assault. When really, why aren't we talking about men and the fact that they're the perpetrators? And so why aren't we talking about how to educate men and socialize men to not engage in these kinds of behaviors? So putting the onus on the men who are the perpetrators versus the women. And I think in our current era, you're right, it's so interesting because women are coming forward and telling their stories, and articulating the injustices that they've endured. But again, in so many ways, you could say the onus is on us. Why don't we name the name? You know, why don't we share more stories? And that's where I totally concur with Katz, because I'd like to say, all right, let's start with the men, right? You know, how can we begin to you know, bring men on board to hold themselves accountable, and to simply not engage in these kinds of behaviors. And that's really his frame, is a more active responsibility, active teaching of men, and men taking on the onus of this problem, because they're the perpetrators by and large, right? Not entirely, but by and large, right. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, it's wonderful to get your perspective.
That was so great.
Fascinating.
I really enjoyed the conversation.
I enjoyed the conversation with you too. We'll have to have you back once again. Abigail Brooks, assistant professor at Providence College. She's the director of women's studies there, and so you can check her out. She has a book published, which we talked to you about last time, so you should read that. It's right on my bedstand too. Yeah, that was fun. So thank you so much for joining us today. I really enjoyed it. Everyone hang tight as we get set up for our next guest.